The heavy rain arrived in the middle of the night, with the droplets slamming against the windows like the knocks of a spirit calling someone's name. The rain didn't stop, and the wind howled as if it were the breath of a ghost still looking for a place to rest. As usual, when the rain began to fall, the old church would reveal strange figures, souls silently waiting in the dark. Down the quiet road, past a dark and eerie forest, stood the old, dilapidated house. Still silent and mysterious, as though it were an enigma never dared to be solved. The church, which the villagers always avoided whenever it rained, was believed to harbor a new soul every time the rain fell, and every soul seemed to wait for an untold story. Quan, a son of the village, had returned after years of studying in the city. He had heard the stories of the old house since he was a child, but he never believed them. However, when he came back to the small village, he couldn't shake the strange pull he felt toward the mysterious occurrences that seemed to happen whenever the rain poured. He decided, not just out of curiosity but driven by an inexplicable force, to visit the church. On his first night back, when the rain began to fall, Quan made his way toward the house. The sun had long since set, and only the faint glow of dim streetlights illuminated the old church's crumbling walls. The wind howled past the windows, whispering eerie stories, but Quan couldn't make out the words. It was then that he felt an unnatural coldness creeping into his bones, a fear he couldn't explain. As he stepped into the church, his footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, but it wasn't only his steps that he heard. Quan started to hear other footsteps, light and ghostly, brushing past him. That sensation, as if someone was standing too close, made his hair stand on end, but when he turned around, no one was there. At that very moment, a gust of wind blew through, slamming open a nearby window, leaving the room colder and darker than before. Quan felt a strange presence in the air, as though invisible eyes were watching his every move. He glanced around and saw an old painting hanging on the wall, a woman's portrait. Her long hair covered her face, but her eyes gleamed brightly, fixed straight ahead, locking with his. Quan's fingers brushed against the painting, and as he looked back, it seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if someone had moved behind it. Suddenly, a strange noise came from the far corner of the room, startling him. He turned to face it and saw an old wooden door creaking open. This door led into a dark hallway, as though it opened into another world. Quan hesitated, but something urged him to cross the threshold, as if the darkness beyond was calling him. Entering the hallway, the air grew thick with tension. Each of his footsteps rang out in the heavy silence and the whispering. Barely audible voices seemed to echo from every direction, making it impossible for Quan to tell what was real and what was not. But as he approached the end of the hallway, a faint light flickered from an old wooden door. Quan slowly opened it, revealing a small room with a bed, an old mirror, and nothing else. The mirror, however, was no ordinary mirror. It seemed to hold a deep secret. Quan's reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. In the mirror, he saw a woman standing behind him, her eyes cold and deep, as though she had been waiting for him. Quan turned, but there was no one there. He doubted himself for a moment, thinking he must have imagined it. But when he looked back at the mirror, the woman was still standing there, unmoving, staring directly at him. Her gaze chilled him to the bone, and it felt as though something dark was watching him. At that moment, he heard a whisper from behind, "You can't escape. The souls in the rain will never let you go." Quan stumbled back from the mirror, his heart racing in his chest. The coldness that had crept into his body intensified, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His mind was reeling with questions, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The woman in the mirror, she couldn't have been real. It had to have been a trick of the light, a shadow from the dim room. But when he turned away from the mirror, the chill didn't fade, it lingered, clinging to his skin, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some sign of what was truly happening. The room, once so still, now seemed alive with an unsettling energy. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the house itself was breathing, and the floor beneath him creaked as if it were about to give way. Suddenly, a low voice cut through the stillness, carrying on the air like a breeze through a cracked window. "You have no idea what you've walked into." Quan froze, his blood running cold. He spun around, but saw nothing. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it felt so near, so close. He strained his ears, but the house was silent once more. The whispering started again, this time faint but persistent. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, telling tales of pain, regret, and sorrow. Quan's mind raced, and despite the fear clawing at him, he felt an undeniable urge to uncover the truth. He turned toward the door at the far end of the room, beyond the mirror. The light that had flickered earlier was now steady, illuminating a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into the earth below. Quan's body screamed at him to leave, to run back to the safety of the village, but something inside him, something he couldn't explain, compelled him forward. With each step down the stairs, the temperature dropped and the air grew thicker. It was as though he was descending deeper into the heart of the house, into its very soul. The flickering light barely revealed the narrow path ahead, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the darkness, too loud, too real. At the bottom of the stairs, Quan found himself standing before another door. This one was old, its wood cracked and worn as though it had been untouched for years. He hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the cold iron handle. Then, with a quiet breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. The room beyond was a large chamber, its ceiling towering far above him. The walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient books, their pages yellowed with age, some torn, others barely holding together. In the center of the room, however, stood something that made his heart skip a beat, a stone altar. The altar was covered in dust and cobwebs, and on it a small, cracked urn sat as though waiting for someone to claim it. The room reeked of decay, but it wasn't the scent of mold or dust. It was something far worse. It was the scent of death. Souls trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. As he approached the altar, Quan's eyes caught something at the far end of the room. A shadow, not the shadow of a person, but something more unsettling. The shadow flickered, bending unnaturally, shifting in and out of shape. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, moving with purpose. Then, in a voice that was not his own, a whisper came from the shadows, "You shouldn't be here." Quan felt his breath catch in his throat. His body froze, his muscles refusing to obey his mind's commands. It was as if the air itself had thickened, making movement impossible. His eyes were locked onto the shadow, unable to look away. It felt as if something was slowly creeping closer, step by step, its presence overwhelming. "Who are you?" Quan managed to whisper, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadow shifted once more, and from its depths emerged a face, pale, ghostly, and yet eerily familiar. It was the woman from the mirror, but this time her face was clearer. Her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "I am the one who has waited," she said, her voice echoing in his mind. "I am the keeper of the rain-soaked souls. I am the one who cannot move on, who cannot leave this place until the story is told." Quan staggered back, his head spinning. He had to get out, he had to leave, but the room, the house, felt alive, closing in around him. Every corner seemed to hold a new threat. Every shadow a new torment. The walls began to shift, the books on the shelves began to whisper in tongues, and the cold grew unbearable. Before he could react, the shadow spoke again, louder this time, with a force that rattled his bones. "You have heard their cries, now you must listen to their stories." Suddenly, the woman's face twisted into a look of intense sorrow. She reached out, her ghostly fingers grazing his cheek. "They were once like you," she whispered, living, breathing. "But now they are lost, trapped by their own regrets, their own unfinished business, and now you have joined them." The room seemed to collapse around him, the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing down. Quan tried to run, but his legs refused to move. The shadow reached out, its cold fingers brushing against his skin, and the world around him began to blur. Quan's mind was a chaotic whirlwind, the woman's voice, now echoing within him, reverberated against the very core of his being. He felt a pull, as though the entire room was dragging him deeper into the abyss of forgotten souls, into a realm where time held no meaning. His heart pounded fiercely in his chest as the shadow's icy fingers lingered on his skin. He had to get out, he had to escape before it was too late. With all the strength he could muster, Quan broke free of the shadow's grip, stumbling backward toward the altar. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs felt as though they were made of stone. The air was thick with the suffocating presence of the spirits that haunted this place, each one reaching out from the darkness, begging to be seen, to be heard. But even as he tried to move, he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was alive, alive in a way that was unnatural, twisted. The walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, and the air itself was charged with an unearthly energy. Everything felt wrong, and yet it felt inevitable. There was no escape, no way out of this place. This house that had been consumed by the darkness of countless souls. The woman's face lingered in his mind, her glowing eyes a constant presence, haunting his every thought. Her words echoed, "You have heard their cries, now you must listen to their stories." But what did she mean? What stories? Who were these souls? Why had he been chosen to be here? Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence, so faint that it could have been a trick of his mind. It was a voice. Soft but growing clearer with each passing second. It was a man's voice, low and mournful, speaking words that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Please, someone, hear me." Quan turned to face the sound, his eyes darting around the room. The walls seemed to shift again, as though the room itself was a living entity responding to the spirit's plea. And then from the darkness of the far corner, another shadow emerged. This one was different from the others. It was humanoid, but distorted, twisted by the sorrow that clung to it. Its face was obscured, but Quan could feel the weight of its sadness, its regret. The shadow moved toward him, slow but deliberate, its form becoming clearer with every step. As it approached, Quan realized the figure was once a man who looked as though he had been trapped in this place for far too long. His eyes, hollow and sunken, fixed on Quan with an intensity that made the air feel even colder. "Please, help me," the man whispered, his voice breaking with despair. Quan swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet refused to move. Something inside him, a strange, unexplainable force, compelled him to stay. There was something about the man, something about the way he looked at Quan that made him feel responsible. The shadow man reached out, his hand trembling as it extended toward him. "I was just like you," he said, his voice rasping as if each word took everything he had left. "I thought I could outrun my past, outrun my regrets, but I was wrong." Quan stood frozen, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" He finally managed to choke out, the words barely a whisper. The shadow man seemed to hesitate for a moment, his hand hovering just inches away from Quan's face. "You don't understand. I didn't know how much I had hurt until it was too late. I didn't know that the things I left behind would tie me to this place, to this curse." His hand dropped slowly, and his eyes seemed to fill with the weight of 1,000 regrets. "You must listen, or you too will be bound like I am." Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing darker, thicker. The walls groaned as if in pain, and the ceiling above cracked, letting in a single beam of pale moonlight that illuminated the man's face. "I am bound to this house by the things I never said, the things I never did, my life, my death. None of it makes sense anymore. You must listen before it's too late." Before Quan could respond, the figure began to fade, the darkness pulling it back into the depths of the room. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping to an unbearable low. In that instant, a cold realization washed over him. The man was not alone. Each soul in this place had its own story, its own regrets, and just like the man, they would never be able to leave until their stories were heard. "The rain, it brings them," the voice of the woman echoed again, more faint this time. "The souls that are trapped, waiting to be freed, they cannot leave unless someone listens, unless someone helps them face their regrets." Quan's chest tightened, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on him. He had to understand. He had to know what these souls were trying to tell him. And so, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him, he knew he had no choice but to listen. As he stood there, alone in the darkened room, the sound of the rain grew louder, filling the silence. The story of the man, the woman, and all the other souls still trapped within these walls had only just begun. But Quan realized with a chill that ran through him that listening to their stories might be the only way he could escape this nightmare. The room was silent again, but the silence was heavy. Quan stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The shadow of the man had vanished, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "I didn't know how much I had hurt," the man had said, but Quan knew this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had walked through this house, everyone who had been touched by its curse. He glanced around the dimly lit room, his eyes falling on the dusty altar. The stone surface seemed to pulse with an energy that was both ancient and sorrowful. The more he looked, the more he could sense the presence of the spirits trapped here. They weren't just memories or echoes, they were real. Their pain, their regrets, they were alive, feeding off the house's energy, feeding off the rain that never seemed to stop. Suddenly the air shifted. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, and for a fleeting moment the shadows on the walls took on shapes that looked like people, like souls who had been forgotten, their faces contorted in anguish. Quan's breath caught in his throat as he took a step back, unable to tear his gaze away. "Help us," a voice whispered. The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, just beyond the edge of his consciousness. Quan's heart skipped a beat as he tried to focus on the sound, but it was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it had come. The voices were getting louder now, filling the room with their pleas. It wasn't just one voice anymore, there were dozens, hundreds. All crying out for help, for release. He clutched his head in his hands, trying to block out the overwhelming chorus. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice trembling with fear and frustration. "What do you need me to do?" The voices fell silent, and for a moment all that could be heard was the soft patter of rain against the windows. Then, just as the silence became unbearable, the woman's voice returned, echoing once again from the shadows. The stories. Must be told, their regrets must be heard. The words once again hit him like a wave. Quan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He didn't know how much longer he could endure this relentless pressure, this overwhelming presence, but he knew he had to. He couldn't leave until he understood why he was here. He couldn't leave until the stories of these lost souls were told. And so, as the rain continued to fall, Quan stepped forward toward the altar, feeling as though he were walking through thick fog. Every step was heavier than the last, as if the house itself was resisting his presence, holding him captive in its embrace, but there was no turning back now. The stone altar loomed before him, and he felt drawn to it. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. The moment he touched the stone, a surge of energy coursed through his body, sharp, like a bolt of lightning, and then everything went dark. Quan's eyes snapped open. He was no longer in the room. The house, the altar, the rain, they were gone. He was standing in a vast, empty landscape, nothing but darkness stretching out in every direction. His feet were bare, and the ground beneath him was soft, like wet earth, yet it gave no sound when he moved. The air was thick, heavy with a suffocating silence, and then from the darkness they came. Figures, shadows at first, but slowly taking shape. They were people, men and women. Their faces filled with sorrow and regret, their eyes hollow, like those of the man he had seen earlier. They moved toward him, slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. And yet Quan knew that time here was not the same. There was no sense of time in this place, only endless, lingering regret. One of the figures stepped forward. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red as though she had been crying for years. She was dressed in a white gown, but it was stained with dirt and blood. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, her voice a raspy whisper. "You are the one they have been waiting for." Quan felt his chest tighten. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper as he looked into her eyes, feeling the weight of her sorrow pressing down on him. The woman's lips trembled as she spoke. I was once like you. I thought I could escape my past, but no one can escape what they've done. No one can outrun their regrets." Her words were like daggers to his heart. They felt too real, too painful. She was one of the souls, one of the countless lost spirits trapped by their own wrongdoings. "Please, you must listen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We cannot leave until you hear our stories. We cannot find peace until we are understood." Quan looked around at the figures gathering around him. They were all waiting, all silently pleading with him. He could see their faces now, each one filled with a different kind of pain. Some were angry, others mournful, some were desperate, but all of them shared one thing, the unshakable weight of their regrets. As he stood there overwhelmed, he felt a sudden surge of understanding. This place wasn't just a house, it was a prison built from the weight of unspoken words, unfinished business, and unresolved sorrow. The souls here were bound by their own actions, unable to move on until their stories were told, until their regrets were acknowledged. And now it was his turn. Quan understood that he was not just a witness to their pain, he was the key to their release. But to free them, he had to listen. He had to hear each of their stories, no matter how painful, no matter how much they hurt. He took a deep breath and looked at the woman before him. "I will listen," he said softly. "I will hear your stories." At those words, a wave of relief seemed to wash over the woman's face. Her eyes softened and she stepped back, allowing the other spirits to take her place. One by one, the souls began to speak. The souls began to speak, each one sharing the weight of their regret. Quan stood in the center of the dark, endless landscape, surrounded by the tormented figures of the lost. The woman's face, once filled with sorrow, had now softened into a look of gratitude as the others began to tell their tales. Each story was different. Yet they all shared a common thread, the inability to escape the consequences of their actions. The first soul to step forward was a man, his face gaunt and hollow, his body hunched with weariness. He wore a suit, torn and worn from years of wandering. His voice cracked as he spoke, as if each word was pulled from the depths of his soul. "I was a businessman," he began, his voice shaky, yet laced with bitterness. "I worked my whole life to build an empire. But I lost myself along the way. I hurt those closest to me, betrayed them for power. I thought I could control everything: money, people, fate, but now I see it. My success came at the cost of everything that mattered." The man's eyes were filled with a sorrow that no words could express. "I lost my family, I lost my soul." He paused as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "I should have loved them, I should have chosen love over ambition, but I was too blind." Quan listened, his heart heavy with empathy. The man's story was painful, but it wasn't his alone. The same pattern seemed to emerge with each soul that stepped forward, each one torn by their choices, trapped in the relentless loop of their past. The next soul to speak was a woman, young and vibrant in life, but now hollow-eyed and ashen. She had the appearance of someone who had once been full of dreams, but was now utterly broken. She looked directly at Quan, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I was in love," she whispered, her voice trembling with a deep, aching sorrow. "He was everything to me, but I was selfish. I wanted him all to myself. I pushed him away, out of fear, out of jealousy. I couldn't see that he was slipping away until it was too late. Now he's gone, and I'm here alone with nothing but this endless void." Her words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper into Quan's chest. She stood there, her hands clenched tightly by her sides, as if holding onto the remnants of her broken heart. "I never told him I loved him," she said, the pain in her voice unmistakable. "I never showed him how much he meant to me. Now I will never have that chance. I never got to say goodbye." Quan's throat tightened. He couldn't imagine the weight of living with such a regret, with such a finality. The woman's soul seemed to hang in the balance between life and death, suspended in her inability to confront her own feelings. One by one, the souls shared their stories. Some were of betrayal and greed. Others of lost love and broken promises. The room, though still filled with an unnatural darkness, felt charged with the energy of their pain. Every word spoken was like a confession, a release of the burden they had carried for so long. And with every story that was shared, Quan felt the weight of the house itself begin to shift. As he listened to each soul, he began to feel a strange connection to them, not just their pain, but their longing. They were all searching for something that would allow them to move on. They weren't just trapped by their regrets, they were trapped by their inability to forgive themselves. Quan knew that he had to help them find that forgiveness, not just for themselves, but for each other. Only then could they be freed, but there was one story that still needed to be told. A shadow at the farthest edge of the room stirred, a presence that Quan had yet to confront. It was the figure of a man. Older than the others, his face hidden in the darkness, his form barely distinguishable from the surrounding gloom. "You've listened to their stories," a voice rumbled from the darkness, deep and guttural, "but there is one more you must hear." The voice was like a force of nature, vibrating through the very air around Quan. It was commanding, but not in a way that demanded obedience. No, this voice spoke from a place of ancient sorrow, as if it carried the weight of countless lifetimes of suffering. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face that was both haunting and familiar. The man's eyes were pale, almost lifeless, and his skin seemed to be peeling away from his bones as though time had claimed him long ago. He was dressed in tattered robes, and there was an aura of despair surrounding him. "I am the keeper," the figure said, his voice carrying an eerie finality. "The keeper of the stories you've heard. I am the one who has bound them all together." Quan's chest tightened as the man's words sank in. He understood now. The stories were not just the soul's regrets. They were a curse, a chain that kept them trapped in this place, unable to move on until they were released. "What do you mean by keeper?" Quan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes darkened, and he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I am the one who has trapped them all here. I am the one who made sure their regrets would never be forgotten. They cannot leave until they face the one who holds the key to their salvation." Quan's heart raced. The weight of the man's words was overwhelming. It became clear that the spirit's suffering was not merely a result of their own actions. It was a consequence of something far greater, something that Quan had yet to understand fully. The figure reached out toward Quan, his skeletal hand trembling. "And you, my dear boy, are the key. You are the one who must decide their fate." With that, the room seemed to spin. The walls closed in around him and the shadows deepened, as though swallowing the very light that had dared to exist in this cursed place. The room seemed to collapse inward, the shadows pressing tighter around Quan, suffocating him with their unseen weight. The figure, the keeper, stood before him, its ancient eyes filled with an unsettling calm. Every inch of the space around them seemed to ripple with tension, as if the very air were holding its breath. Quan felt his heart race, the sheer magnitude of what he was being told sinking into his bones. "You are the key," the keeper repeated, its voice cold and unyielding like the wind howling through a desolate place. "You must decide their fate and your own." Quan's mind was spinning. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and confusion. How could he be the key? How could he, a mere mortal, have the power to undo centuries of pain and suffering? How could he undo the curse that bound these souls? He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The weight of the keeper's gaze was unbearable. The darkness seemed to intensify with each passing moment, and he felt an overwhelming pull, as though the very walls were trying to drag him into the depths of the curse. "Tell me," Quan choked out, his voice trembling, "why are they trapped here? Why have you done this?" The keeper's lips curled into a faint, twisted smile. "This place, this house, is built on the foundation of regret," it said. "It is a prison forged by the collective suffering of the souls that passed through it. Souls who in life never faced the consequences of their actions. Souls who in death could never find peace." The keeper took a step closer, its form shifting like smoke, as though it were no longer bound by the physical limitations of space and time. "I am the one who binds them here. I am the one who feeds on their pain. For as long as their regrets remain unaddressed, this house will stand. And as long as this house stands, I remain powerful." A chill swept over Quan as the keeper's words settled into him. The house, the rain, the souls, all of it was intertwined, and he had unwittingly stepped into a trap. But the question remained, how could he possibly undo all of this? The keeper continued, its voice now like a low, whispering wind. "You think you can save them, Quan. You think you can listen to their stories and set them free. But you cannot change what has been done. I have fed on their regret for centuries. I have become their prison, and now you must make the ultimate choice." Quan stepped back, his mind racing. What choice? What could he do? He wasn't a priest, he wasn't a medium. He had no power over the dead, no way to command these spirits to leave. He was just him. The weight of their suffering seemed too much to bear, and then it came to him, a realization. As faint as the flickering of a candle, but just enough to give him hope. He remembered the man's words, the one who had been consumed by ambition. He remembered the woman's cry, the one who had lost her love, too selfish to speak her feelings. The key wasn't power, he realized. It wasn't some ancient ritual or spell. The key was forgiveness. The keeper had said that the souls were trapped by their regrets, and Quan now understood that the curse wasn't just about their actions. It was about their inability to forgive themselves. To release them, he had to forgive them. He had to help them forgive themselves. "Please," Quan said, his voice hoarse with determination. "They need to be forgiven. I will help them face their regrets, help them make peace with their past. But you," he looked directly at the keeper, his eyes burning with the strength he hadn't known he had. "You need to let them go." The keeper's face twisted into an expression of twisted amusement. "You think you can forgive them? You think that will release them? Their pain is my power, and without it I will cease to exist. They are my food, my sustenance. You cannot take that from me." But Quan's resolve hardened. He could see it now. The keeper was terrified, terrified of losing control, terrified that if the souls were freed, if the cycle of regret was broken, the keeper would vanish. "You've held them captive long enough," Quan said. "The only thing that binds them here is their inability to face what they've done. Their only true prison is the regret that you've taught them to cling to." For a moment, the keeper stood motionless. And the room grew so cold that Quan could see his breath in front of him, like a cloud of vapor. But then, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the house, the keeper lunged forward, its form becoming a swirling mass of darkness and rage. "You dare challenge me," it hissed. "You cannot undo what has been done. I am eternal. I am the darkness that binds them." But just as quickly as it had lunged, the keeper stopped. A soft, golden light began to seep into the room, shining from the cracks in the walls, filtering through the air like morning sunlight breaking through clouds. It was as if the house itself was beginning to breathe again, its oppressive hold starting to loosen. The spirits, the souls, murmured softly in the distance, their voices a collective sigh of relief. Quan turned to face them, his heart pounding in his chest. They were watching him, waiting for him to act, waiting for him to lead them. "Tell them," the keeper said, its voice now hollow and desperate. "Tell them they will never be free, tell them they will never." But the light grew brighter, cutting through the darkness, drowning out the keeper's words. The house began to tremble, and a low rumble echoed through the walls, as if the very earth was shifting beneath them. Quan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he knew what he had to do. He raised his voice, louder than the keeper's shrieks, and called out to the souls. "Let go of your regrets," he cried. "Forgive yourselves, you are not your mistakes. You are not your pain, let go and be free." The souls began to move slowly at first, as if unsure of themselves. But then one by one they stepped forward, their forms growing lighter, less burdened by the weight of their regrets. The air around them shimmered with the energy of release. The keeper screamed in fury, but its power was fading, its form dissolving like smoke in the wind. The spirits, once bound by their sorrow, began to rise into the air, their faces softening. Their eyes glowing with peace, they had forgiven themselves, and as they did, the house, the curse, the rain, all of it began to fade. And in that moment, Quan realized that he had not just freed them, he had freed himself. The room shuddered one final time, and the air felt alive with an overwhelming energy. The keeper, its power now diminished, let out a scream so guttural and filled with rage that it echoed through the very fabric of the house. The dark presence that had once defined the house now seemed to wane, like a dying flame flickering out in the wind. The walls, once pulsating with malevolent energy, cracked and crumbled, the weight that had been pressing on them for centuries slowly lifting away. Quan stood at the center of it all, his body trembling but his heart steady. The spirits, the souls, were rising one by one like light breaking through an endless storm. Their forms were shifting, becoming lighter, less tethered to the earth and more connected to something greater, something pure. The golden light continued to flood the room, a beacon of release, forgiveness, and peace. The keeper, now nothing more than a shadow, writhed in the corner of the room, its once powerful form disintegrating. It reached out toward the spirits, its voice weak and raspy, as though begging for the souls to return to feed it once more. "You cannot escape," the keeper hissed, its voice barely a whisper. "You are mine. You will never be free." But the spirits ignored it. They were no longer bound by the keeper's lies, by the weight of their regrets. They had forgiven themselves, and in doing so they had broken the curse that had bound them to this house for so long. One by one the spirits turned to Quan, their faces now serene and peaceful, free from the torment of their pasts. They nodded to him, each one silently expressing their gratitude, their relief. And as they did, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the golden light that filled the room. The woman, the first soul that had spoken to him, was the last to ascend. She looked at him with eyes that were now filled with peace, her face soft and radiant. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like the gentlest breeze. "You gave us the one thing we needed, the chance to forgive. You gave us freedom." Quan stood still, watching as the last of the souls faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the light, and then with a deep breath he felt the weight of the house's curse lift. The oppressive darkness that had filled the walls for so long was gone. In its place there was nothing but peace. As the last soul disappeared, the rain outside the house stopped. The patter of droplets on the roof ceased, and for the first time since Quan had arrived, the night was quiet. The storm had passed. The house, once alive with the sounds of restless spirits, now stood in a profound stillness. The oppressive air was gone, and for the first time in centuries, it felt empty. But not in a bad way. It was empty in the sense that a wound had been healed, that something broken had finally been put to rest. Quan took a deep breath, the air now feeling fresh and clean. He stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The altar, once heavy with the weight of regret, now seemed like just another piece of forgotten history. The darkness had been dispelled, and with it so had the curse. But as he turned to leave, he paused at the door. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the scent of earth and new beginnings. He stepped out into the night, into the calm after the storm, and as he looked up at the sky, he saw the first glimmers of stars beginning to appear through the clearing clouds. And then, just as he was about to leave, he heard a soft, familiar voice. "Thank you," it whispered, and Quan turned. There, standing in the doorway, was the woman, her face filled with an expression of peace and gratitude. You did it. You freed us all." With a final, serene smile, she turned and walked into the light, disappearing with the others. Quan stood there watching the stars, the gentle breeze, the peace that now filled the air. He felt a sense of closure, of finality, as if the story he had been a part of had come to its natural conclusion. He had listened to the spirits, he had heard their stories, and in doing so, he had freed them. As he walked away from the house, he realized that the curse wasn't just something the house had placed on the souls. It was something they had carried with them, something they had created themselves through their own inability to forgive. But now, with the curse lifted, they were free, and so was he. The rain had finally stopped.